In the late 1950s, Temirtau was not meant to be a city in the usual sense. It was designed as a project. At the center of this project stood the Karaganda metallurgical plant, one of the largest industrial constructions of its time. The Soviet Union needed steel, and Temirtau was chosen as the place where that steel would be produced. What existed here before was a small settlement, quickly transformed by plans, deadlines, and expectations. Thousands of people arrived in a short period of time: young workers, Komsomol volunteers, demobilized soldiers, specialists sent from different republics of the USSR. Many came with enthusiasm, others with obligation, but almost all arrived with the same assumption that basic living conditions would follow soon enough. The city grew faster than its infrastructure. Housing was temporary by design. Tents, barracks, improvised dormitories, streets appeared before water pipelines. Construction sites expanded before utilities could catch up. The logic was simple. First build the plant, then everything else would follow. For a time, this approach seemed workable. Work was constant. Shifts were long. The scale of construction created a sense of purpose. People accepted discomfort as part of a larger goal. Living conditions were difficult, but they were seen as temporary, something to endure rather than question. By the summer of 1959, that balance began to break. The number of residents had grown far beyond initial estimates. Water supply became unreliable. Food distribution struggled to meet demand. Canteens were overcrowded and shortages became frequent. Heat made conditions worse, especially in tent camps where shade and ventilation were limited. Everyday routines required effort. Getting drinking water meant standing in long lines. Meals were inconsistent. Rest was difficult. These were not exceptional problems on their own, but they were shared by thousands of people at the same time. Communication between workers and administration remained formal and distant. Complaints moved slowly through official channels, often meeting delays or vague responses. From the perspective of planners, the project continued on schedule. From the perspective of those living on the ground, daily life was becoming increasingly strained. What made the situation fragile was not a single failure, but accumulation. Months of waiting, repeated shortages, promises that did not translate into visible change. Temirtau was no longer just a construction site. It was a dense concentration of people living under pressure, with limited resources and few outlets for frustration. There were no political slogans, no organized opposition, no calls for protest. What existed instead was fatigue. By mid-1959, the city had reached a point where even minor disruptions carried weight. Ordinary inconveniences were no longer isolated events. They were interpreted as part of a broader pattern, one where effort and sacrifice were not being matched by basic living conditions. The system had been designed to move quickly. Human needs had been expected to wait. The tension that formed in Temirtau did not announce itself loudly. It built quietly, day by day, within routines that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. What followed would not begin as a planned action or a political statement. It would begin in a place as ordinary as a queue, where patience finally ran out. The tension that had been building in Temirtau for months did not erupt suddenly. It surfaced through an ordinary situation that many residents experienced every day, waiting for food and water. By the summer of 1959, queues had become a fixed part of daily life. People stood in line early in the morning and returned again later in the day, often without knowing whether supplies would last. Canteens were overcrowded, delivery schedules were unreliable, and information about availability was inconsistent. Small delays carried real consequences. On one of these days, a routine queue turned into an argument. The immediate cause was unclear and unimportant in itself. A misunderstanding over service, a shortage, a refusal to distribute what people expected to receive. What mattered was the response. Voices were raised. Tempers, already worn thin, did not settle quickly. Others nearby joined in, not out of coordination, but recognition. Many had experienced the same difficulties and felt the same exhaustion. The situation shifted from a personal dispute to a collective reaction within minutes. Crowds formed quickly. People left queues and moved toward nearby administrative buildings and service facilities. The movement was spontaneous, driven by proximity rather than planning. What had started as frustration became visible action, spreading through word of mouth and physical presence rather than instruction. There were no slogans and no clear demands. The crowd expressed dissatisfaction through motion rather than speech. As numbers grew, restraint weakened. Windows were broken. Equipment was damaged. Food storage areas were entered. These actions were not organized and did not follow a clear pattern. They reflected release rather than strategy. Authorities on the ground were unprepared for the scale and speed of events. Local administrators and police forces lacked the manpower and clarity needed to respond immediately. Attempts to calm the situation were inconsistent and largely ineffective. What made the unrest difficult to control was its structure, or lack of it. There was no single group to negotiate with and no leadership to isolate. Participants came and went, drawn by proximity and emotion rather than commitment. Some observed, others joined briefly, and many acted without a clear sense of direction. As evening approached, the unrest intensified rather than faded. The crowd moved through different parts of the city, targeting places associated with distribution and administration. Fires were started in some locations. Damage increased, not because of escalation plans, but because the situation continued without interruption. At this stage, the events in Temirtau were no longer a local disturbance. Reports reached regional authorities, and the assessment changed. What had begun as a breakdown of routine order was now viewed as a threat to control over a major industrial project. Decisions were made quickly and decisively. Additional forces were ordered into the city. Military units and internal security personnel were mobilized, not to negotiate conditions, but to restore order. Their arrival marked a clear shift in how the situation would be handled. For the people still on the streets, this change was immediately visible. Uniforms replaced administrators. Movement was restricted. Commands replaced discussion. The period of spontaneous unrest was ending. What followed would be defined not by crowd dynamics, but by force, and by the consequences that would shape how the events in Temirtau were remembered, recorded, and later explained. By the time additional forces arrived in Temirtau, the character of events had already changed. What began as spontaneous unrest had disrupted normal administration, damaged facilities, and interrupted work at critical sites. For regional authorities, the priority was no longer understanding causes, but restoring order. Units of internal troops and the army were deployed to key points across the city. Administrative buildings, transport routes, and industrial areas were secured. Curfews and movement restrictions were introduced, sometimes informally at first, then more systematically as control tightened. The presence of armed forces altered behavior quickly. Crowds dispersed. Gatherings became smaller and shorter. Public spaces emptied. Where resistance remained, it was met with force. Arrests were carried out on the spot. Some participants attempted to flee, others were detained based on proximity rather than verified involvement. The goal was speed and containment rather than precision. By nightfall, Temirtau was largely quiet. In the following hours, security operations continued. Patrols moved through residential areas, tent camps, and dormitories. Searches were conducted for those believed to have taken part in the unrest. Identification checks became routine, and access to certain areas was restricted. Casualties were reported during the suppression. There were dead and injured. Exact numbers varied across internal documents and were not disclosed publicly. Medical facilities treated the wounded under close supervision. Information about the nature of injuries and the circumstances under which they occurred was limited to official channels. For residents, details circulated through personal accounts rather than announcements. Detentions continued over the next days. Hundreds were questioned. Dozens faced formal charges. Investigations focused on restoring discipline rather than reconstructing the full sequence of events. Files were compiled quickly. Responsibility was assigned individually, even though the unrest had no clear organizers. Court proceedings followed a standardized pattern. Some received prison sentences, others were reassigned, dismissed, or sent away from the construction site. The aim was to demonstrate consequence and deter repetition. Publicly, the incident was framed as a breach of order caused by undisciplined elements. References to living conditions, shortages, or administrative failures were minimal. The official narrative emphasized restoration and continuity. Work at the metallurgical plant resumed under increased oversight. Schedules were adjusted and security presence remained visible. Construction continued, reinforcing the message that the project would not be delayed. Within the city, life returned cautiously. Queues reappeared. Shifts restarted. Temporary housing remained in place. What had changed was not the structure of daily life, but the boundaries around it. People spoke less openly, avoided large gatherings, and focused on routine. The unrest was not discussed publicly, and over time it became something remembered quietly rather than collectively acknowledged. The city was under control again, but the events of 1959 left a record, not in newspapers, but in internal reports, court files, and personal memory. Temirtau moved forward, carrying both the industrial success it was built to achieve and the unresolved questions about how quickly pressure can turn routine hardship into open conflict. After order was restored in Temirtau, the events of 1959 did not become a subject of public reflection or debate. There were no official explanations addressed to residents, no open acknowledgement of what had led to the unrest, and no broader discussion of responsibility. The priority shifted quickly from response to closure. Administrative measures followed quietly. Local leadership was reviewed, some officials were reassigned or removed, supervisory structures were adjusted. These changes were presented as routine cadrovia решения rather than responses to specific failures. The connection between everyday living conditions and the unrest was not emphasized in official documentation intended for wider circulation. At the construction sites and in residential camps, visible adjustments appeared gradually. Food distribution improved. Water supply became more stable. Housing conditions were addressed selectively, focusing on the most overcrowded areas. These changes were practical, not framed as corrective actions, but they altered daily life enough to reduce immediate pressure. Security presence remained noticeable for some time. Patrols continued, and informal restrictions on gatherings persisted. People adapted by keeping to routines and avoiding situations that might attract attention. The city functioned, but within narrower social boundaries. Judicial outcomes reinforced this atmosphere. Those convicted during the investigations served sentences or were removed from the project entirely. Their cases were not publicly revisited, and their stories did not enter collective discussion. Responsibility was individualized while the broader context remained unspoken. In official records, the unrest was reduced to a brief entry, a disturbance. a violation of order, a resolved issue. There was no reference to the scale of participation or the depth of dissatisfaction. The absence of detail was itself a form of resolution. The event was closed by being left unexplained. Over time, Temirtau continued to grow. The metallurgical plant became operational. Permanent housing replaced temporary camps. The city gained stability and structure. For newer residents, the events of 1959 were unknown. For those who had lived through them, memory remained personal and fragmented. Stories were shared privately, often without dates or specifics, shaped by caution and distance. The silence surrounding the unrest did not erase it, but it changed how it existed. Without public acknowledgement, the events remained isolated in memory rather than integrated into history. They were not denied, but they were not discussed. What endured was a lesson learned quietly by institutions rather than openly by society. Planning continued, but with closer attention to logistics. Large projects moved forward with more emphasis on supply chains, housing, and basic services, not because of public pressure, but because earlier assumptions had proven fragile. The consequences of Temirtau were therefore uneven. They did not appear in speeches or publications. They appeared in procedures, margins, and internal decisions. The city moved on without revisiting the moment when it briefly slipped beyond control, and in doing so, it followed a familiar pattern, resolving disruption not through explanation, but through silence and adjustment. Looking back, the events in Temirtau stand out not because of their scale, but because of what they exposed. This was not a political uprising and not an organized protest. It was a breakdown that emerged from ordinary conditions pushed beyond their limits. The people involved did not arrive with demands or slogans. They arrived to work. What they encountered was a gap between planning and reality. Large industrial goals moved forward rapidly, while basic living needs were treated as secondary and temporary. For a time, this imbalance was tolerated. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. Temirtau revealed how quickly a system built on acceleration could lose stability. When infrastructure lagged behind population growth and when everyday shortages became routine, frustration accumulated quietly. There was no single moment when order collapsed. Instead, pressure increased until even minor disruptions carried disproportionate weight. The response to the unrest followed a familiar pattern. Control was restored through force and administrative measures. Individual responsibility was emphasized, while structural causes were left unexamined in public. The system corrected itself operationally rather than reflectively. This approach proved effective in the short term. Work resumed. Construction continued. The project moved forward. But the absence of open discussion meant that lessons remained internal. Adjustments were made quietly, absorbed into procedures rather than articulated as policy changes. Temirtau influenced how future projects were managed, even if it was never cited as a reference. What the incident demonstrated was not failure of authority, but fragility of balance. Large-scale plans depended on the assumption that people could endure prolonged uncertainty and discomfort without consequence. Temirtau showed the limits of that assumption. The city itself did not remain defined by the unrest. Over time, it became a functioning industrial center with permanent housing, stable services, and a settled population. For later generations, 1959 existed only as a vague reference, if it existed at all. Yet the episode remains significant precisely because it lacked ideological framing. It showed that social tension could emerge without political language, driven purely by material conditions. This made it harder to classify and easier to silence. Temirtau was not unique, but it was early. In later decades, similar pressures would appear in other cities and projects, sometimes contained, sometimes not. What happened here provided an early example of how rapidly momentum could turn into instability when human needs were deferred for too long. History often focuses on moments when systems collapse publicly. Temirtau offers a different perspective, one where disruption occurred briefly, was corrected decisively, and then absorbed without acknowledgement. The lesson it offered was practical rather than symbolic. Stability required not only discipline and planning, but timing, an understanding that infrastructure and everyday life could not always wait for future solutions. The city moved forward, the system adjusted, and the events of 1959 remained where many such moments were placed, not at the center of history, but just beneath its surface.